Hello y'all, what the fuck is up? Or as a metalcore band might say, what the fuck is up? It's the Cozy Representative back again for another video. You know what fucking time it is. Alright, now although they are not looked back on and talked about as much as, say, Panic at the Disco or Fall Out Boy, if you were in any way a fan of the Fueled by Ramen emo scene in the mid to late 2000s, there's a definite chance you were jamming to The Academy Is during this time. They never had a Sugar We're Going Down, or an I Write Sins Not Tragedies type radio hit, and they never headlined arenas, but there was a point in time where such feats didn't seem too out of the question for the Chicago emo group to achieve. They were an extremely beloved band during this time and had a strong, dedicated fan base, of which I was a part of, and almost all of their records hold up extremely well to this day. So, what happened? Why weren't the Academy Is ever a chart-topping band or a household name like so many of their contemporaries? What caused them to dissolve after only 3 records? Well, today, I'm gonna dive into the career of the very special mid-2000s emo act, The Academy Is. Let's go. So let's dive into their early years, shall we? In 2002, a tall 17-year-old kid from the suburbs of Chicago named William Beckett released a solo acoustic full-length under the name Remember Maine, titled The Last Place You Look. This album is extremely influenced by early Dashboard Confessional, to the point where some songs sound like a kid who heard the Swiss Army Romance once and said, I need to make music like that. The songs are innocent and heartfelt and overwhelmingly emo, with most of the subject matter being about loneliness and having crushes on girls who just won't give you the time of day.
Come on kid, you gotta figure this out. Just act stronger, you got her number. What are you worried about? It's girls like this that we live for.
This album came out on a Chicago-based indie label founded by Johnny Minardi called LLR Recordings, who at that point had released some albums by other small, local Chicago bands such as August Premiere or 504 Plan. The Remember Maine album quickly became one of the highest-selling albums on that label, and in an interview on the 8123 podcast, Johnny Minardi described the release of that album as being, quote, a turning point when he went from selling tens of albums to selling hundreds of albums. And he described it as his first big feat on the label. This was in part thanks to the music circulating on pre-MySpace websites such as mp3.com, Smart Punk, and Inner Punk, and also with the help of the budding emo explosion at the time. Not in the mainstream, by the way, but during the undergrounds. William Beckett wasn't involved in the mainstream emo explosion until a few years later, but we'll get into that. During this time of Remember Maine, William Beckett's high school friend Adam T. Siska took note of the songwriting talent of his friend and began aligning himself socially with William as much as possible, and eventually became the merch guy at shows for Remember Maine. In the March of 2003, William Beckett and Adam T. Siska started a band called The Academy. William sang and Adam played bass along with their high school friends Mike Carden on guitar, AJ Latrace on guitar as well, and Mike Del Principe on drums. That summer, the band had also signed to the label that Remember Maine was signed to, LLR Recordings. Seeing as how Remember Maine was a big success on the label, William decided to move on from his solo acoustic project and do The Academy full-time, and the label wanted to follow him. The band released their first EP, called the Academy EP, on March 23rd, 2004 on LLR, and began attracting attention around Chicago as well as online. This was somewhat of an abstract, conceptual EP that they released, inspired by bands such as Coheed and Cambria and Gatsby's American Dream, as well as having similarities to early Taking Back Sunday. Personally, I love this EP, and I think it's super underrated. It's quite a different sound than what the Academy Is ended up becoming. It's on a little bit more on the post-hardcore side of things than the pop-punk style, which they eventually evolved into. And it's very cool to hear a heavier style of the band and a more abstract, conceptual style. I highly recommend actually going to check out this EP if you've never heard it before. It's really cool, and I think it deserves more praise and attention that it's gotten. And Anyways, halfway through 2004, the band signed to Fueled by Ramen, who at the time were a relatively small label, which was gaining some traction after having released Fall Out Boy's debut Take This to Your Grave a year prior. Both bands being from Chicago, Fall Out Boy were friends with the Academy, which led to their signing. In 2004, after signing to Fueled by Ramen, the Academy added the is to their name and began writing their first full-length, Almost Here. I believe this was due to another band being called the Academy. As Adam T. Siska explains on an episode of John Walker's podcast, knowing that unlike their EP, which was only sold online and at a couple record stores in Chicago, their upcoming LP would have national distribution and would be sold in record stores across the country. This affected the way that they approached the songwriting, not necessarily in the sense that they were trying to go for commercial success per se, or a radio hit. That wasn't really in their brains, but they were definitely moving away from the more abstract, experimental elements of their EP to take a more direct approach to the songs and to appeal to a more broad audience. The end result, which came out on February 8th, 2005, is an extremely tight and well-rounded pop-punk record, which is as bold as it is catchy. Oh, it's called Almost Here, by the way, if you didn't fucking get that.
Attention, attention, may I have all your eyes and ears to the front of the room, if only for 1 second.
And while it is a more straightforward and in-the-pocket feel than their EP, the Academy has still managed to make a very unique debut. Almost Here definitely fit right in with a lot of the other pop-punk that came out in 2005, and I see it as having similarities to Fall Out Boy's From Under the Cork Tree, and I guess more so Take This to Your Grave, Acceptance's Phantoms, and The Audition's Controversy Loves Company, all of which came out in the same year. However, despite having obvious similarities to their contemporaries, Almost Here still managed to show that the Academy had their own sound and were far from a cookie-cutter pop-punk band. Most notably, William Beckett's standout, recognizable voice and unique vocal melodies that were as thoughtful and complex as they were catchy showed that the band had more tricks in their bag than your average pop-punk act. The instrumentals were at times breezy and at times intense, with tracks like Black Mamba and Season being upbeat, standout songs. Not to mention Down and Out is probably one of the best slower and mellower type songs ever written by a Fueled by Ramen band, in my opinion. Aside from the great songwriting, Almost Here stood out in more complex ways too. Also in John Walker's podcast, Adam Siska mentioned that the band had wrote the songs in order as they appear on the album. For example, Attention was intentionally written as being the first track, Season was intentionally the second track, written second, etc., etc. So the sequence of the album is super smooth and intentional. And most importantly, a lot of the songs on Almost Here were written about the band themselves. The album is sort of a loose concept album about being an underground band who plan to leave the dull suburbs which they come from, with intentions to get in the van and travel the country with their music and take the world by storm. Literally, the Academy were writing about the Academy. They open the record literally demanding your attention. Season tackles their desire to turn heads and make waves and not just be another generic band with heartless songs. The phrase that pays is slightly more existential, reminding you to take a chance at what you love now, because you don't know how much time you have left on planet Earth. Black Mamba is probably the most poignant and bold, addressing the flaws of the music scene as a whole, as well as the desire to hit the road and finally leave your fucking apartment. Yes, the subject matter is bold and biting and very relevant to what the band were going through during this album cycle. The cool thing about the band using this subject matter, though, is it never comes off as tacky or cheesy. Aside from Black Mamba, you only really realize that most of the songs are about the band and the scene when you look a bit more deeply into them than what appears on surface level. The songs have many layers and can take on many meanings, which leaves for a very satisfying listen for anyone, because even though the songs at their core are about being in a band and who are about to release your debut record, you don't have to be in a band about to release your debut record to enjoy it, you know what I mean? And that in itself is a very difficult thing to accomplish from a songwriting standpoint, in my opinion. Now, going back to my original question, where did the Academy go wrong in their career? Well, a couple very important things, key things, happened during the touring cycle of Almost Here that affected the career of the band for the rest of their tenure. These things were rarely talked about or even realized at the time, but with time, certain things about this time period have come out to light that sort of make it a bit more obvious about why things ended up the way they did. So, Almost Here gets released right at the beginning of 2005. An electrifying debut from a promising young band who were definitely in the right place at the right time, so to speak, on a label that was about to explode, fueled by ramen, and a scene that was about to explode as well, the emo and pop-punk scene. The first thing, and this was something that was kept super hush-hush at the time, but it has been confirmed in Adam Siska's interview on John Walker's podcast, as well as the original guitar player AJ Latrace's interview, also on John Walker's podcast. Right after, or possibly during, it is semi-unclear, the recording of Almost Here, original guitar player AJ Latrace, as well as original drummer Mike Del Principe, were fired from the Academy Is. The reason for the firing is also unclear, however the effects it had on the band were apparent for the rest of their career. You see, as former member AJ Latrace explained on the aforementioned John Walker podcast, in the early days of the Academy Is, every member had their own specific role. William Beckett wrote all the lyrics and melodies. William and Mike Carden were in charge of the business side of the band. And Adam Siska was sort of the mascot, or the face of the band, if you will. And AJ Latrace and Mike Del Principe were heavily involved in the writing of the music instrumentally. So, for whatever reason, the rest of the band felt the need to fire the two members who were responsible for the writing of most of the music on both their EP and Almost Here. It must have been some sort of personal reason, because to add insult to injury, AJ Latrace and Mike Del Principe's names are nowhere to be found on the liner notes of Almost Here. I have it right here, I can show you. Alright, let's crack open my copy of Almost Here by the Academy Is, purchased way back in the day. Let's take a look at these liner notes, shall we? This album was apparently recorded with AJ Latrace on guitar and Mike Del Principe on drums. Oh yeah, you see that? You see that? We got the two people who replaced them, Thomas Conrad on guitar, and Andy Mrotek, aka The Butcher, on drums. AJ Latrace and Mike Del Principe are nowhere to be found. By the way, my copy of Almost Here by the Academy Is signed by Gabe Saporta on the back, which is really funny to me, and really cool. Hello, Gabe. So yes, that is one thing that contributed to the, sort of the course of the rest of their career, and also another thing that happened during the touring cycle of Almost Here. Well, let me put it to you like this. Almost Here comes out in February of 2005. The Academy Is' friends and label mates, Fall Out Boy, released their breakout sophomore record, From Under the Cork Tree, a few months later, in May of 2005. From Under the Cork Tree was a huge major label success, bringing the style of pop-punk that Fall Out Boy, as well as the Academy Is, played to mainstream attention, putting bands like this all over TRL and MTV, and the radio, starting somewhat of a neon pop-punk revolution. Now, this wasn't a problem for the Academy Is. In fact, this was actually great for the Academy Is, because Fall Out Boy weren't necessarily competition, so to speak, for the Academy Is. You see, Fall Out Boy were at the top of the pop-punk totem pole as far as mainstream attention goes, and in 2005, the Academy Is were right in second place behind them. They were in the position to basically directly ride the coattails of Fall Out Boy's success and become the next big chart-topping pop-punk band. It was the perfect situation for them, really. What was a problem for the Academy Is, however, were other bands on Fueled by Ramen who were lower than them on the Fueled by Ramen emo pop-punk totem pole, getting larger and gaining more attention than them, aka the real competition. And on September 27th, 2005, that's exactly what happened. Now, what happened on September 27th, 2005? You might be asking me. I'll tell you, a little album called A Fever You Can't Sweat Out by a little band called Panic at the Disco got released, and yeah, that's what happened, you silly goose. While sales of A Fever You Can't Sweat Out began relatively slow, with it debuting at number 112 on the Billboard 200, it spent 88 weeks on the Billboard charts, that's fucking crazy, as it slowly climbed, where it finally peaked at number 4 on August 5th, 2006, almost a year after it was released. Also, interestingly enough, in November of 2005, the Academy Is' headlining tour was announced. Touring on Almost Here, I might add, entitled The Truck Stops and State Lines Tour. The original lineup for the tour was to have Panic at the Disco go on first, and then Hello Goodbye, and then Acceptance, and then The Academy Is. By the time the tour began, in February of 2006, Panic had been bumped up from first on the bill to direct support, so going on right before The Academy Is, due to their exploding mainstream popularity. On the John Walker podcast, as I've already mentioned several times, Adam Siska further explains the toll the success played on the Academy as his career. Roll it.
And then the other factor, I think, was the arrival of Panic at the Disco, not just the music world, but in like Feel by Ramen and Crush Management, the emo scene. Like prior to their arrival and like their style of writing and their unbelievable like platform of like imagery, and I mean, you were there firsthand, so you know better than I do. Like,
yeah, it was a force.
Yeah, like an unbelievable force, and one that I fully respect to this day, and like one that I'm still close with to this day.
But you guys shared management and label and sometimes even crew with Panic.
Yep.
Yeah.
And still to this day, like a lot of their like core crew are people that had their first jobs working for the Academy is.
So do you think like the label and the management just reprioritized?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I don't want to pin our faults on them. Looking back on it, like they were just doing what they always do, which is to maximize profit. And when there's something that's so clear cut, like brilliant, like that Fever You Can't Sweat Out was a new thing, I have no reason to believe that they would do anything other than follow that. But for us, like prior to that record coming out and their arrival on that scene, the whole thing with emo was like kind of this anti-nu metal in the way that like Nirvana was like anti like hair metal. It was like interact with your fan base. You're not larger than life. You play the show, you load out, you go to the merch table, you talk to the fans. It's like some of the most personable, down-to-earth musicians you'll ever meet, because it's like this blue-collar DIY formula. And I think we were like tailor-made for success within that platform.
Yeah.
And when Panic at the Disco showed up, that platform flew right out the window because they were larger than life. And Fall Out Boy wasn't like that. The Academy's wasn't like that. Motion City Soundtrack, May, Armor for Sleep, those bands that were kind of like the norm power players of the scene prior to that were, like I said, in that kind of like DIY, play like 250 plus shows a year in a van. And Panic was like the first band that like, you know, that Nothing Rhymes with Circus tour was like a full-on stadium act, you know, like, and I don't think we were capable of competing with that. I don't think we were ever meant to.
Right. But you were naturally thrown into the mix.
Yeah, naturally we wanted to compete with it because, you know, we wanted to please the record label and management in the same way that they did. And we also wanted to buy a house and making sure that we would maybe have generational wealth, you know? So it's like, I mean, that's a really hard thing to do. And shortly after that, you know, Bill became a father, which puts more of a weight on trying to make a lucrative model. And meanwhile, we made a record that was like very counterintuitive to trying to be lucrative. And the Santi record was like, we simultaneously wanted to be nothing like a stadium act, and we also wanted to be the biggest band in the world. So like, I don't think we are, as soon as they showed up, I don't think we knew how to do anything natural anymore, you know?
Regardless, the band toured hard on Almost Here alongside the likes of Fall Out Boy, Something Corporate, Midtown, Matchbook Romance, Motion City Soundtrack, and Armor for Sleep, to name a few. They released an acoustic EP in 2006 called From the Carpet. They took part in the 2006 Warped Tour, and after that began recording their second full-length record.
My next guests are from the Chicago area. They're here tonight with a song from their brand new album, Santi. Please welcome The Academy is...
Took a step back as the room was filling up, and I was packed against these people who were tossing up a strong vibe.
The second The Academy is full-length, entitled Santi, was released on April 2nd, 2007 on a partnership with Fueled by Ramen as well as Atlantic Records, making this their major label debut. Also, guitarist Tom Conrad had left the band just before the recording process, so this album was the first album with their new guitar player, their third lead guitar player in their short history as a band, Michael Guy Shizlet. The album debuted at number 32 on the Billboard Top 200, selling 33,000 copies first week. Now that would be a pretty impressive number if those were their first week sales, say, this year in 2019. But I have to mention what the first week sales of their contemporaries were at the time. The Panic at the Disco 2008 album, Pretty Odd, sold 139,000 copies first week, and Fall Out Boy's 2007 album, Infinity on High, sold an insane 260,000 copies first week. First week! So obviously the Academy's sales were small fucking potatoes compared to the competition. From a musical standpoint, Santi was a cool progression from the sunny pop punk they laid down on Almost Here, showing a much darker side to the band while simultaneously a much bigger, more classic rock tinged sound, with William Beckett doing his best Robert Plant impersonation on We've Got a Big Mess on Our Hands, and the band sounding slightly like T-Rex on Bulls in Brooklyn. That being said, while you could tell this album was a progression from Almost Here, in a lot of ways it seemed very out of left field for the Academy or really any Fueled by Ramen emo band at the time. Well, it's definitely emo in the sense that it's a very dark themed and also sounding record. I don't even consider Santi to really be a pop-punk record per se. While there are moments of poppiness, most of the punk side had been replaced by alternative rock, or as I said, straight-up classic rock influence. I think the songs on Santi are great. I've always loved this record. I really have. I bought it when it came out, all the way back in 2007. It's right here. It's been with me all this time. And I thought it was their best record for a really long time. But that's just me. I was a Santi guy. I was on Team Santi is a great record, so to speak. But like I said, that's just me. Not everyone was into Santi when it came out, and it got a mixed response from critics and fans alike. Its two singles, We've Got a Big Mess on Our Hands and Everything We Had, did okay, but failed to make any sort of big splash. Directly following the release of Santi, the Academy has embarked on the 2007 Honda Civic Tour with Cobra Starship, Plus 44, and Fall Out Boy, which I attended, as well as a headlining tour, the Sleeping with Giants Tour featuring Armor for Sleep, The Rocket Summer in Sherwood, and Cobra Starship, which I also attended. It was during this time that the Academy's webisodes, entitled TAI-TV, began becoming a staple part of their whole existence as a band. TAI-TV in and of itself became very popular and gave you an inside look into the band members and their crew, showing off their humorous personalities through funny skits as well as more serious looks into touring, the writing and recording of their albums, and inner workings as a band. I see these webisodes as being pretty ahead of their time, existing before making vlogs on YouTube was a standard thing for many bands and entertainers. YouTube as a whole was still an incredibly new thing when the Academy's were making TAI-TV, and this was obviously years before Instagram stories and Snapchat came into play. So, while I, the cozy representative, was a very big Santi fan when it came out, there were a fair amount of people who were not. The album didn't sell as much as the label wanted, and while the Academy's had grown a lot more popular than they were in 2005 when they released Almost Here, and they had a solid group of dedicated fans who truly loved the band, they had yet to hit the mainstream, or make waves in the way that some of their peers had. And once the touring cycle for Santi had wound down, bands like All Time Low, Boys Like Girls, The Main, and We the Kings had risen to popularity, causing somewhat of an oversaturation within the mid to late 2000s pop-punk wave. And while many bands were reaping the rewards of the explosion of the genre, it became harder and harder for bands to stand out. By the time 2008 had rolled around and the Academy's were beginning to write their third record, this type of pop-punk had, in a lot of ways, essentially became hair metal. Certain people had become millionaires, and there was way less of an underground, grassroots feel to it. There was far more of a divide between fans and the bands, and there was an extreme pressure to make a splash in the mainstream on a major label and become the next big thing. This was also just a few years before the neon emo pop explosion had all but died. So it just made sense to try and strike while the iron was hot, right? In comes the Academy's third and final record, Fast Times at Barrington High.
summer girls with summer hair.
So personally for me, I loved this record when it dropped. A whole lot. I've always liked it. And how could I not? The Academy is one of my favorite bands ever and could do no wrong in my eyes. Also, I love and have always loved upbeat neon pop punk, which is exactly what this record is. It's the Academy's version of a super tight, polished pop record. And for what it's worth, I think they did a very good job. However, much like the mixed response they got from Santi, Fast Times at Barrington High also got somewhat of a mixed response from fans, and has always been the subject of debate over the years between me and other The Academy's fans. Now, if Santi was a left turn for the band, then Fast Times was a sharp turn right. It's bright, sunny, poppy, breezy, fun, tight, polished neon pop punk. And here's the thing. Is it okay for a band to make a polished pop record? Yes, absolutely. If you disagree, you're a fucking elitist piece of shit. Is it okay for the Academy's to make a polished pop record? Yes, totally. However, it was the context of Fast Times at Barrington High that leads to some gray area and conflict and debate between fans over its legitimacy. Let me elaborate. They had a shot at having a chart-topping hit with Santi, but the darker nature of the record led to it not having much of a commercial appeal, and it did not sell as well as their label would have liked it to. It's almost like the Academy has had one last shot at having a huge hit and becoming a chart-topping success like some of their peers.
So take a chance and make it because it's the last you'll ever get.
Many fans wanted them to go back to their poppier, almost here sound. What would it make sense for the Academy's to try to do to break out of the club scene and achieve the next level of success? The answer is simple and clear. Head right back into the studio after the touring cycle of Santi had wound up and quickly put together a summery pop album about high school, mirroring the style of newer bands who had been gaining success, such as All Time Low and We the Kings. So basically, what I'm saying is, what I'm bringing up is the theory that Fast Times at Barrington High is essentially a cash grab. A record that perhaps the band did not want to make, perhaps they did not all fully believe in, that perhaps some people in charge of them told them that they had to do in order to fully achieve that sweet, sweet success that they had been pining for. Now, I'm not saying that this is the truth about this record. It has never been confirmed nor denied by any band members as far as I know. But the timing and the style of the record is just fishy enough for some people to believe this. And there have been many people that I've met over the years who openly hate and are distraught by Fast Times, and I get it. I've often felt weird about this record myself. It might just be a cash grab. Who knows? We don't know. However, although I am a person who sees the negative in Fast Times, I am also a person who sees the positive. So let's talk about the positive. I've met a lot of people who actually love this record and love the poppier side of The Academy's. Well, ironically, it is a record that takes influence from the style of bands who formed and gained prominence after The Academy's released Almost Here. Bands who probably cited The Academy's as an influence. The Academy's arguably executed this neon pop-punk style way more tastefully than most of these newcomers did. The album is a lot more diverse and interesting than, say, We the Kings' debut. It's a better front-to-back listen than, say, Boys Like Girls' debut. It's a lot more heartfelt, if you ask me, than All Time Low's So Wrong It's Right. It's less gimmicky and Saturday morning cartoon-like than, say, Forever the Sickest Kids' underdog alma mater. So, for all intents and purposes, if you ask me, the cozy representative, The Academy has made a good record. Fast Times at Barrington High, for what it is a good record. Summer Hair == Forever Young is an anthemic certified summertime banger. The Test is a perfect mid-tempo track showing off William Beckett's lush vocals during the verses. Rumored Nights is an underrated track with great descriptive storytelling lyrics and a powerful emotive chorus that has always stuck with me. Coppertone, another underrated track, is probably one of the Academy's best songs. After the Last Midtown Show is a beautiful ballad that made me cry one night earlier this year when I was feeling really sad and nostalgic and revisiting this album for the first time in a while. True story. And Paper Chase and One More Weekend, the closing tracks on the album, really do feel like the ending of one's high school senior year into the first summer of one's proper adulthood. That's one thing about this record that I wasn't able to see at the time when it came out, because little young elitist Julian spent many years angry that the Academy has had the gall to make a sellout pop record about high school. If you look at it through a different lens, and especially now for me personally having spent several years out of high school, it makes me realize that they really did make a perfect high school nostalgia record. Let me expand on that. Part of what made it more genuine than what their peers were doing at the time is that they weren't dudes in their 20s trying to write songs about literally being in high school for high schoolers. Currently. Like Forever the Sickest Kids were. Instead, with Fast Times, they were creating a story based around being an adult and looking back and reliving that nostalgia. Almost like the effect of watching a John Hughes movie once you're in your 20s or 30s. This album could easily be misconstrued as trying to appeal to the kids. Totally. But the more years I spend with this album, I realize that it's less for the actual high schooler and more for the adult who wishes to revisit those high school emotions in a genuine, emotional, nostalgic candor. Like I said, it's like watching Dazed and Confused or a John Hughes movie. Regardless, whether you thought that Fast Times was a sellout cash grab album or a genuinely decent pop record earnestly looking back on high school times, the album did fairly well, selling 35,000 copies first week and landing a number 17 spot on the Billboard Top 200. It was named the 46th best album of 2008 by Rolling Stone, and by October 2009, the album sales stood at 85,000. And while About a Girl is probably their most popular song to date, it was not a proper hit by major label standards, and while they turned some new heads with Fast Times, they hadn't really grown much more popular than they were when they released Santi, still playing the same size clubs they always had been. Although they hadn't hit the next level of popularity, they had garnered a very dedicated fan base who would always back them and come to the shows, regardless of if they had a radio hit or not, and that's an important note as I will finish this thing off with my closing thoughts and my reasoning of where I think the Academy went wrong. So, in 2009, they released the Lost in Pacific Time EP, their last official release. It was an underrated EP that kind of sounds like a mix between their sound on both Santi and Fast Times put into a nice little blender. In 2010, they announced they would be taking some time to write their fourth record, and it was slated for a 2011 release. And just as they were starting to tease promo for a new record, they broke up seemingly out of nowhere. Now, let's listen to Adam T. Siska on the Emo Social Club podcast as he describes this last year or two of the Academy and what inevitably led to the shelving of their fourth record and ultimately their breakup.
Let me see if there's some other questions here. Are we ever going to hear TII 4? I think that's a no, probably at this point. Like, you don't. I'm assuming you don't know if you're going to do anything else.
I mean, to be honest with you, there is a record that.
Never mind.
It never came out, and I don't know if I would call it a whole record, but there's songs there, and like, in a weird way, like I think. When we were doing that record in 2010, it was like ahead of its time. And I remember like management being like, there's not really a lot of guitar here. You guys are a guitar band. And we were like, yeah, well, it was funny. When we were writing the last record, our manager called us and he was like, it was the day after the Super Bowl when the Saints started the second half with an onside kick and like just dominated Peyton Manning and the Colts. And
all those words didn't make any sense
right,
to me.
It was a big sports moment.
A big sports ball moment went down.
Yeah,
Someone did good sports.
So some people will know what I'm talking about. But our manager called us and he's like, "That's what you guys need. You need an unexpected onside kick. Like, you got to like do something really different this time." So we did, and we added a keyboard player, and like went for this kind of different sound. Mm-hmm. And the label didn't like it, and the management didn't like it, and then we broke up. Then that sound kind of became like
the thing
that everyone's doing now. It felt like we were making our first record in a way, you know, like which was a nice place to be in. And it sucks that it went the way that it did. Like the label didn't really like it, so they sent Bill in to do a lot of like co-writing with people, and that kind of some of the co-writing that he did, I think, became his solo record, and I didn't really like it at all. And that's kind of why the band ended. It was like, well, forget this,
Yeah.
Like,
So basically, I almost see the Academy as a truly special band who fell victim to the influence of management, record labels, record sales, and the scene around them. The first place they seemingly went wrong was the firing of the original drummer and the original guitar player after the recording of Almost Here. Even Adam Siska said this himself. While I loved seeing Michael Guy Chislett and the Butcher in episodes of TAI TV back in the day, it seems like they lost their original vision after Almost Here and seemed a little musically lost. While Santi and Fast Times were great records, it didn't feel like they were really growing naturally as a band. More so, each record was a left turn completely into something different. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We got some great music out of it, but it feels like the original storyline of that band of underdogs coming out of the suburbs of Chicago to risk it all and hit the road that they so perfectly encapsulated on Almost Here got lost somewhere. That character that they created seemed to have all but disappeared. Not to mention the musicality they had going on their first EP and Almost Here never came back in the same way. It seems like because they had fired the two original members who seemed to be responsible for their early musicality, we never got a true follow-up to Almost Here and never got to see the true evolution of the original The Academy is, or should I say, the Academy. The second place where I believe they went wrong along the way was it seems like in certain places they got a little too caught up in trying to match the immediate successes of their peers as opposed to just being the best the Academy is they could be and growing with the dedicated fan base that they had who would have followed them no matter what. This is why Fast Times, albeit a good record, leaves a sour taste in people's mouths. In a lot of ways it doesn't feel like a very natural record. It almost feels like Pete Wentz called them up and said, "Hey guys, you gotta write a neon pop record and get a platinum hit or else this ship won't sail much longer." And that's exactly why they broke up too. What Siski said in that podcast that I just played, they had a fourth record written that they were very proud of, but the fucking label didn't like it and decided they needed to go in with co-writers and they just fucking broke up. They could have did what, for example, The Maine did on their record Pioneer and said, "Fuck you, record label," and just released it anyway. They had fans that were dedicated enough and would have followed them anywhere, no matter what. And obviously hindsight is 2020, and as I said earlier, it definitely made sense for them at the time to try to strike while the iron was hot, but they might still be around today had they stopped listening to the record labels trying to get them to have a platinum single and just went with their gut and grew to be a great band that would have lasted more than 3 records. It's a shame that the Academy didn't last longer, and I feel like there was so much more great music they could have made, and honestly, I just miss them. They were a great band, and it makes me sad that they broke up. It makes me sad that it doesn't seem like, there's ever really going to be a reunion of sorts, besides the Almost Here anniversary tour they did in 2015. Anyways, anybody who was around at the time, who was in the Fueled by Ramen wave, who knew the Academy at the time, knew what a special band they were, and I think it's safe to say that we all miss them. We all wonder who's doing what. Yeah. So, thank you for watching my video about the Academy This is the Cozy Representative, signing out. More to come. Please subscribe if you like it. And have a great day. And, yeah. Santi, motherfucker. Peace.